China has been steadily chipping away at Taiwan's diplomatic recognition, and nowhere is it more apparent than in the South Pacific. Over the past 5 years, the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, and Nauru switched allegiances from Taipei to Beijing. Now, China's strategy of offering economic aid and infrastructure projects, along with agreements that include security cooperation, proved difficult for Taiwan to match. So, is Taiwan set to lose more friends in the Pacific Islands? Or can the tide turn back in Taipei's favor? I'm Divya Gopalan, and you're watching Connected on Taiwan Plus. To understand what Taiwan is up against and how it can help the South Pacific fend off China's economic and political pressure, we are joined by Cleo Paskal, non-resident senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Cleo speaking to us from Washington. Thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you very much for having me, and even more so for covering the topic. It's one that's crucial strategically for anything that comes next. And I think there's starting to be a growing awareness of that here in Washington as well.
All right, just for a clear understanding of the South Pacific region and the Pacific Islands, can you give us an overview of basically how that looks geopolitically in particular to Washington and Beijing, and where the focus is on?
Yes, thank you. It's very helpful because the Pacific, if you talk about the Pacific Islands, you're talking about a region that covers about up to 20% of the planet. So it's useful to disaggregate it because from a hardcore strategic perspective, there are some areas that are more likely going to be part of a fight than others. And that's very well understood for over 130 years. The U.S. has been part of the Pacific for at least since the Spanish-American War. In 1898, the U.S. beat Spain and took the Philippines and Guam. And that same year, it annexed Hawaii. And only 2 years later, it signed an agreement with American Samoa, which still exists. And so the U.S. has been very much part of the Pacific, an embedded part of the Pacific for that amount of time, because it realized that, and this was very explicit. Teddy Roosevelt spoke about this during when he sent the Great White Fleet around the Pacific. This was sort of at very early 1900s. He sent 16 brand new battleships all the way through the Pacific, including showing up in what was then China, to show the strength of the U.S. military in the Pacific, and to say that the U.S. is as much of a Pacific power as an Atlantic power. Because the understanding was that if a hostile foreign power controlled the center of the Pacific, the U.S. wasn't safe, nor could it trade. And of course, that's exactly what happened. From 1914 until about 1944, Japan controlled what had been Spanish territories and then became German, and then the Japanese took them in the countries that are now Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands, two of which still recognize Taiwan, and as well the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. And it was because Japan controlled that center part of the Pacific that it was in a position after it hit Pearl Harbor to fend the U.S. off and to make it very difficult for the U.S. to get back across the Pacific. So that was why after World War II, the U.S. signed these very special agreements with what are now those three countries, Palau and Marshall Islands, which also recognize Taiwan, and the Federated States of Micronesia, which means that they are independent countries, but the U.S. gets strategic denial. Their citizens can live and work freely in the U.S. They can serve in the U.S. military. They're entwined in the way that no other countries are with the United States. And that's because many American presidents, from 1961 to 1981, every single American president had served in the Pacific theater during World War II. And they understood the importance of the Central Pacific to U.S. security and prosperity, and they were determined not to make the same mistake and to let a hostile foreign power set up in the center of the Pacific.
This is an area that, as you said, of incredible strategic importance to the U.S. So what does that have to do with Taiwan maintaining its alliances in the region?
once you are engaged with the Chinese Communist Party, and again, you have a Chinese embassy in your country, that embassy functions like a forward operating location for influence and intelligence operations, and will start to try to sino-form, so to speak, the countries to make them more pliant, first dependent and then ultimately dependent on Beijing. And that can include, for example, the bringing in of Chinese criminal organization, the distortion of the rule of law, heavy corruption. It affects the people at the ground level and the whole political and economic structure in a way that is fundamentally detrimental to the individuals, to the people there. So recognizing Taiwan gives you a buffer. You don't have that Chinese embassy, and you are in partnership with a country that, like the people of the region, value democracy, transparency, accountability, rule of law, freedom of religion, all those things that make us human.
Okay, so in the past 5 years, as we've mentioned, we've seen a number of countries switch allegiances from Taipei to Beijing. Can you tell us what prompted that?
So there were three big ones: Solomon Islands, Kiribati, and most recently Nauru. It was a combination of things. One was, to be frank, I don't think that the Pacific Islands were a very high priority for Taipei. There was I don't know how to describe it, but you could feel it that there within the diplomatic corps, it wasn't a prestigious posting. It wasn't perceived as somewhere where you could build a career. But it's not solely the fault of Taipei. There was also, I think, a big part of the problem was out of Australia, because the Australians kept reassuring the U.S. that they had everything under control. And they really didn't. And they continue to do that today. But when you see Prime Minister Albanese spend 6 days in China, you wonder how much he is willing to jeopardize Australian trade with China, for standing up for Taiwan in a small Pacific island. In fact, it almost becomes potentially a bargaining chip for the Australians in advancing their own economic growth. So I think the Australians have been, for a variety of reasons, have dropped the ball. And the State Department also, especially under the Biden administration, was not very forward-leaning. So you had the Federated States of Micronesian president, for example, who wanted to set up a stronger relationship with Taiwan. This is a country that recognizes China. That would have been strategically incredibly important, because that's the third of those three countries that has this close defense relationship and social and cultural relationship with the U.S. But State Department didn't support him at all. And Taiwan can't move in that sort of a situation if they're not supported by State Department. Again, this was under the Biden administration. So I think that it wasn't perceived as strategically important as it could be. The Australians are playing their own game. And in Taiwan, it hadn't necessarily been considered the priority that I think it is now.
Okay, I want to zoom in on the Solomon Islands, where residents of the most populous island were opposed to the country's diplomatic switch from Taipei to Beijing. Now, former Malaita Premier and opposition leader Daniel Swidani and his advisor Celsus Talifilu were charged last year with unlawful assembly over 2021 protests against aligning with China. Talifilu, a private policy consultant for the Office of the Opposition Leader, explains to us how Beijing also tightens its grip on South Pacific Islands through political influence.
Small island nations in the Pacific would like to have developments in terms of infrastructure, road, bridges, to their various locations that would allow development. Whilst that gap is there, with the kind of fastness or the loans or the arrangements with PRC are often quicker than with traditional bilateral donors. So in that sense, there is that pressure whether to quickly go to China to get those loans, and at the same time knowing that it might be economically not viable. Some of these projects might not end up bringing home the kind of expectations that would at the end repay those loans. So I think the pressure is there. The other would be, when big capital or money is being promised under loans, and in a country like Pacific Island countries get those things, there could be the pressure of geopolitics in terms of voting rights and voting ways at the in international forums. There could be that as well.
Cleo, you've researched the political machinations that have been on the ground in the Solomon Islands, and you've also written about the charges against both Sudani and Talifilu. Can you explain what issues really were lobbed against them and why they were allowed, or why there was that space to be able to charge them for peaceful protests?
Right. This is the latest nonsense charge. This is just kind of pure lawfare. So they were being charged. There were originally 3 unlawful assembly charges against them for. There were protests that happened when Chinese proxies were trying to instigate a vote of no confidence against Premier Sudani. So he was actually premier of the province when they were saying that he was unlawfully assembling. And one of the charges had to be dropped because he was actually in Taiwan at the time of that particular charge. So it's not even really worth going into the charges. They're just the latest in a long line of corruption of the state that's resulted in these lawfare attempts to really bankrupt and break 2 brave people who are fighting for the sovereignty of their people, and they're often painted as pro-American or pro-Taiwan, but they're pro-Solomon Islanders, and what their concerns are. When that switch first happened from Taiwan to China in 2019. Daniel Sudani was premier, and his provincial legislature, backed by the provincial chiefs, put forward this AUKI communique, AUKI, A-U-K-I, which is the capital of the province, which put a moratorium on CCP-linked businesses operating in the province. And they were very clear about why. They were concerned about environmental issues, social issues. They were worried about freedom of religion. They understood the way the CCP operates and its proxies operate when they come into a location, and how it distorts and ravages the society and the environment, and they didn't want anything to do with it. And that made them target number 1 almost on the planet for destruction. And so, for example, when soon after that, Daniel Sudani was in urgent need of medical care, the government of the Solomon Islands refused to pay for the treatment that he needed. It was treatment that he needed. He needed an MRI. And so they didn't have an MRI in the country. And they basically wanted him to die and the problem to disappear. And again, the Australians didn't help. Nobody else helped except for Taiwan. And this was during COVID, which made it even more complicated. But President Tsai at the time personally intervened and brought Mr. Sudani to Taiwan for the medical care that he sorely needed. Now, in an ideal world, that would have been followed up with sending an MRI machine back with him so that Taiwan could show how deeply it cares about democracy, and it does, and that it cared not just about leaders, but also about the people. But it becomes very complicated within Taiwan because there's almost a sense that, well, if you go to China, we're going to walk away, which they didn't do in the case of Daniel Sudani, but which has happened in other places. And this is not what China does. When you've got a country that doesn't recognize China, they stay on the ground and they erode and try to do everything negative they can to destroy and weaken the society until they can come into place. Whereas Taiwan doesn't stay and help build the society and help it strengthen and grow so that it's in a position through its own sovereign actions to break away from China. So that would be one recommendation. For example, currently, right now, in Malaita province, where Celsus and Talifilu and the people who were so clear about their dedication to democracy there's no food in the hospital. They have nothing to eat, even though Australia is, giving over $100 million for security equipment. They're not giving the money the sick need to eat. These are the sort of areas where, yes, it's a country that recognizes China, but certainly there must be organizations within Taiwan who feel that kinship that the people of Malaita have felt with Taiwan, who want to help reinforce the society from the ground up and help them be in a position to defend themselves when this onslaught from China comes.
You've laid out a number of points and ways you feel like Taiwan can still maintain relations, but can the tide turn in the South Pacific? Can you see the possibility of countries coming back on board with Taiwan, should Taiwan take those steps that you've outlined?
So for me, recognition of Taiwan is a metric for how healthy a democracy is, because once it derecognizes Taiwan and heads towards China, and again, remember, in many cases, initially it might only be a dozen or 24 people right at the top that make that switch to China, and they'll be doing it almost invariably for reasons of corruption, things like that. And when you're trying to resist that, the Taiwan ambassador in Palau is excellent, and the work that they're doing, for example, to support the Palauan government in fighting Chinese corruption, is incredibly important. That's the way you do it. You make sure that corruption, that Chinese money and organized crime can't degrade the society and so the democracy to the point where there is a switch. And things like intelligence sharing, forensics, that sort of stuff that helps to combat that corruption is what helps keep those countries strong. So if you want to help rebuild democracy, these are the things, faith, family, freedom, all those things that help keep a society and a democracy strong are entry points. So helping feed the sick, helping with education, helping with transportation systems, with communications, with with trade, especially with trade, investments. This doesn't have to be state-led. This can be state-facilitated, but let those organic engagements thrive all across the region. People want Taiwanese tourists. They much prefer them to Chinese communist tourists, and that creates the people-to-people ties that and the money flows and the transportation links that can really help things blossom.
We're just getting warmed up here, Cleo, but before we continue, a quick word to our audience. If you would like to join the conversation and stay connected to tech and business stories from Taiwan, follow us on our socials. Next, as geopolitical tensions reshape the Pacific, how can Taiwan keep strengthening their bonds there? Stick around. Taiwan's official presence in the South Pacific has been steadily diminishing. It's a blow to Taipei's diplomatic recognition, but the geopolitical repercussions go much further. China's growing footprint in the South Pacific is an indicator of shifting power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region, and it can tip the global balance of influence between democracy and authoritarian states. Now, to understand what's at stake for the South Pacific countries and beyond, we are joined by Cleo Paskal, a non-resident senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and she's joining us from Washington. Now, Cleo, you've often spoken about how CCP investments or influence in a region do not necessarily benefit the people living there. Can you explain?
Yeah, sure. So usually when China comes in, you have to understand they really mapped World War II. So there's a very good study written by a man called Toshio Shihara, whose mother was Taiwanese, father Japanese. He's an American, extremely good researcher, about how the PLA has studied World War II in the Pacific. Which is why when they go into a country, like when they flipped the Solomon Islands, the first place they tried to lease was Tulagi, which was the first place that Japan went into during World War II. They really understand the strategic geography of the region and are very focused on, it's more than dual use and placement, because it's not only civil and military, but the third component that always comes in with the Chinese engagement and investment is corruption. There's always that criminal element to it. And that's really what is destructive for the local societies, because they might be building that port that is clearly has commercial use. That's what they'll say. We're going to help you with trade. And it happens to have specifications that are useful for the PLA Navy. But the third element is they're also smuggling in drugs. There's human trafficking, and all that is also coming in through the port. And that's what's showing up in the societies and in the villages. And it's this sort of entropic warfare, disintegration warfare that is part of the Chinese Communist Party's overt strategy for weakening target countries to be in a position to take it over. So it's the infrastructure, but it's also what's coming in through the infrastructure, like the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. That BRI can also stand for Bribery and Repression Initiative, because that's what travels along the road. It's a way of operating. And so that's become very evident. The social destruction, the political corruption, the economic dependencies across the region are very easy to see. And if anybody's studying it, you can just look at what's happened in the Solomon Islands since 2019, and they switched to China. And you see a country where democracy is degrading, oppression of political opposition is increasing. It's becoming like China, to the point where they're starting to run a program now where they're going to fingerprint, get biometrics of an entire village in anticipation of rolling that out across the entire country so that they can have more societal ground level control.
Well, to understand the impact of China's overtures, we asked Celsus Talifilu, who works for the Solomon Islands opposition leader, whether the citizens of their country benefited since switching allegiance to Beijing.
What's the benefit, apart from what is said in the papers and the tours that were made to China and the promises? We have not yet seen any actual tangible things that are happening on the ground. So one of the biggest benefit is the building of a national stadium. Now, whether that benefits the citizens at large is something yet to be seen. Of course, people mainly in Honiara and the periphery of Honiara have direct benefit in terms of watching sports happening at the place, and even the usage of it is still a question to be asked. Now, I think one of the things that have really benefited, but it's not really special, is the scholarships to Solomon Island students now studying in China. There were questions of neutrality, whether the scheme is for everyone or is being geared towards the supporters of PRC. That is again something that people have flagged. There are questions around it.
So we've heard Celsus Talifilu's experience there, but Cleo, are there instances where it does help, or China's overtures or investments does help the people of the country?
So there are cases where, at least on the surface, and at least initially, they're meeting an urgent need. So, for example, in the Federated States of Micronesia, in the state of Yap, there's currently a crew that has come from China that is rebuilding an old Imperial Japanese runway on an island that it isn't that far away, but because it has no operational runway, it takes days to reach it by boat. So if you have a medical emergency, if your mom gets sick, if you have a complicated labor, anything like that, it's days by boat to a proper hospital. And so they are using that opportunity to rebuild that runway. Now, that was a bid that was put out by the central government, knowing that only this Chinese state-owned industry type company would pick up that bid because it's clearly underpaying for the runway. But the people there have no choice. Nobody is helping them build a runway otherwise. And the federal government, which is very close to China, wants Chinese government and corporate access into even the most remote part of the Federated States of Micronesia. So understanding that those people really need that runway, and the way the dynamic is now, it's only that Chinese company. Even with the Chinese company, and I went there and I took a look at it, they were dumping their raw sewage into the food supply, into the taro patches where they were growing their food. They were starting to try to groom the young girls from the high school nearby. Like, this is a very socially destructive group of people there at the moment, but they need the runway. So the locals are they're just putting up with it, and they're expressing gratitude that somebody is finally building them a runway.
That's a tough balancing act for, I guess, those countries and the people there. Cleo, before we continue, let's get back to Talifilu and talk about the other way that China does engage these countries, and often countries that are developing and much poorer. One of China's tactics seen in many countries where it has Belt and Road projects or partnerships is to extend loans to their governments. Now, Celsus Talifilu explains the economic pressures island nations face when China offers infrastructure loans.
When it comes to the way China is handling its loans to small Pacific Island countries who have very fragile economies and who have to make a judgment whether to get these loans and how do they manage it. And that also leads to intergenerational pressures to the new generation that would have to foot the bills that their foregoing generation made before them. And in the end, are we seeing any increase in livelihood, or are we seeing any development at all, or are we being put in pressures just to get the funding and make short-term gains, but not in the long-term or long run? There could be the generation could face the debts that were created before them.
So Cleo, often these overtures, these loans, the investments come with strings attached. So given the way Taiwan operates, what can Taiwan do, although they may not be able to give as huge offerings, what can they do to make Taiwan's or partnering with Taiwan more palatable for these countries?
So it depends on how you think about a country. China thinks about a country from the top down. What they want to do is capture the elite. But Taiwan, as a democracy, understands, hopefully, that a country is its people. The sovereignty lies within its people. So if you can defend those things that allow people to provide healthcare for their parents and education for their kids and live in a safe environment, and the democracy is healthy, then your relationship will maintain. Now, what undermines that is the corruption. So it doesn't sound self-evident, and I know that there has been and the sort of engagement in the past has been a little bit lazy. And this I'm talking about sort of decades ago. China will give this amount, so we'll give that amount. Well, you don't have to give as much as the Chinese give if you're not being corrupt and you're helping the locals fight the corruption. So because that money that China gives, a lot of it ends up in the pockets of very few people who become very corrupt and very powerful and then use it to put down their population. If the power stays with the population, then the population itself will take care of keeping governments in power that want to maintain the relationship with Taiwan. And I know it sounds sort of Pollyannish or optimistic, but the trick really is to pull on that weakest link in Chinese engagement. I said there were three elements. There's the commercial, the strategic, and the corruption. If you undermine their corruption, if you make it difficult for them to be corrupt, it levels the playing field, and it gives democracy within and transparency and accountability within those countries a chance to flourish. And you don't have to match them dollar for dollar. It's not, somebody once told me that a Chinese official in Africa said, we're going to win because we have an unlimited bribery budget. Well, you don't need an unlimited bribery budget if you have good investigators and prosecutors who are willing to go after the corruption. And part of that can be if Taiwan has a very good sense of Chinese organized crime, helping local journalists report on who is actually coming to invest in their country, doing information sharing and intelligence sharing with organizations that want to go after that corruption. And it could be with other parties. It could be if you're dealing with a country like Palau or Marshall Islands or elsewhere, or even Federated States of Micronesia, if you know what those Chinese gangs are using engagement with local other embassies, even with the Japanese, for example, to help go after some of those corruption trains, you don't need that much money. That Chinese money is going into individual pockets. It's not going into the community. So level the playing field through going after the corruption and help the countries build from the ground up.
All right, so here's Celsus Talifilu again on what Taiwan can specifically do to help the Solomon Islands economically.
Even after Taiwan left, that knowledge still around, but in terms of the infrastructures that's already been dismantled and have nowhere to stay. So I suppose involving in sectors that are locally viable. In this case, I know Fiji and other countries have offices, Taiwanese offices still exist and support some of these things in their countries. I suppose that would be a useful approach for now for Solomon Islands as well, to establish a Taiwanese office that could run projects that are more sustainable and more grounded with the people, rather than flashy big projects that are always always centers in Honiara in most of the cases. So that would be a usual approach.
You know, Taiwan has so many industries here that are critical to global supply chains that that contribute to the world economy. So what do you think, Cleo, Taiwan can do, particularly with its industry, perhaps even its semiconductor strength, to help the Pacific Islands?
The thing about the Pacific Islands is they're all very different. So if you look at a place like Papua New Guinea, that has a larger population and landmass than New Zealand. But if you look at Tuvalu, that's 10,000 people, maybe on very disparate islands. So there's no shortcut. You have to go and talk to the people and work with them, develop collaborations through their educational institutions or through the SPC, which is a regional organization that does technical development. But it's better to do it bilaterally or trilaterally with partners who are there. Japan obviously is a good one in the Northern Pacific. The U.S. I would even say India is really looking to engage in the area and is trying to figure out if it can partner with others there. Be creative, but center the needs of the locals by going there and talking to them and listening to them about what they need. It's going to be different in each location. Some have severe problems with telecommunications, some don't, some need desalination, some don't. So it really is piece by piece. And it's by talking to leaders like Celsus Talifilu, who is a man of incredible integrity and courage, who are from the region and who know it better than I ever will, that you're going to be able to get the answers that you need to forge those deep bonds, or to keep those deep bonds alive, because in many cases they're already there.
Right. You touched on this briefly, but I kind of widen out the whole, the geopolitical importance of Taiwan having these allies, in particular with what does it mean when China exerts its influence in these countries for perhaps, the countries like Australia, like the US, that also use this area for their own defense or for to protect their own territories.
So when President Panuelo from the Federated States of Micronesia wrote about wanting to engage in Taiwan, he was very clear that Chinese engagement with his country was about Taiwan, was about the potential for a kinetic attack on Taiwan, in which case these islands need to be off the board strategically. And we talk a lot about the first island chain and the second island chain, but the U.S. can't get to the first and second island chain if it can't get across the Pacific. So the survival of these countries as places of democracy, transparency, accountability, rule of law, basically non-Chinese pawns, is intricately linked with the survival of Taiwan. I can tell you, I've seen it. That's why you have to go and take a look at what's going on. But China is actively trying to, and it learned this lesson in World War II, make the center of the Pacific, and in the case of Australia, the southern Pacific, inhospitable environments as soon as it flicks the switch, so that nobody can get to Taiwan's aid. It can cut Taiwan off. And this is, it's part of, we know this for the Philippines, and we know this for what they're trying to do with the Southern Islands in Japan. But just beyond the Philippines, you hit Palau, and you hit the whole center of the Pacific. And basically anything that the U.S. hasn't forward deployed now to Guam or the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands will have to get across a vast chunk of the Pacific. That's why the U.S. strategy currently is involving rebuilding some of its old infrastructure, or putting in places like the over-the-horizon radar installation in Palau, rebuilding the runway in Yap. It itself is trying to relearn its lessons and be in a position to forward deploy, but it's definitely not there yet. And Australia might talk big, but it really doesn't have a very big Navy, and it's a long way from Australia to Taiwan. So the survival of Taiwan in case of the horrific potential of a kinetic attack or even a blockade, its survival is very dependent on these Pacific islands being free from the sort of Chinese control that can make them inhospitable to any of the allies trying to get to the defense of Taiwan.
And finally, from the Pacific Islands perspective, for these islands to remain independent and thrive and grow to benefit the people that live there, what should be their message to the Western countries, to the alliances, the Western alliances, and to Taiwan?
Come get to know us. That's what they keep saying. Presence is deterrence, but also presence is understanding. Help us figure out how to navigate these incredibly difficult times. And if their economies are strong and the corruption is minimal, then they will do the work themselves. As you saw with Mr. Talifilu, these are some of the most courageous, principled people I've ever met. They just need a chance. And right now, it's the corrupt elements within their societies that are trying to destroy them and stifle them from within the country so that they're not in a position to fight for their own sovereignty. But figuring out how to help them really starts with getting to know them. Go visit. It's beautiful. Those countries are beautiful. The cultures are wondrous. It's not far from Taiwan, which is what the Chinese know and what Taiwanese should probably learn, and start to build ties. Build school ties, church ties, tourism, investment. These are your neighbors, and their survival and your survival coexist. And you need each other. So get to know them and enjoy living in one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in the world.
Cleo Paskal, thank you so much for giving us much needed context on a region that really isn't spoken about enough.
Thank you. And thank you for covering it. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And I wish I was in Taipei. It's another one of my very favorite cities.
Well, when you're here, definitely do get in touch. And I have a feeling you're setting yourself up for another interview with us. Thank you.